Because as I said before, to me, Key Club is extraordinary. Key Club is everything to me.
I pledge on my honor
to uphold the objectives Key Club International,
to build
my home,
school,
and community,
to serve
my nation,
and God,
and to combat all forces which tend to undermine these institutions.
Good evening, everyone. It is now 27 minutes past 6. We are about to begin. I'm going to press record so we can begin. Amelia, do you want to do the recording or should I go ahead and do the recording? Do I need to record it because it's going to be on YouTube? So I don't need to record it. Okay, great. This evening, ladies and gentlemen, why Caribbean Studies? Over the years, we've had several cases of students not doing well at Caribbean Studies. Last year, the teachers here in Jamaica decided that we were gonna do something to try to get organized since COVID-19 took us by surprise. So what we did, we got together as a group of teachers to create a WhatsApp group. We've moved past the WhatsApp group stage now to doing presentations. Last year, we did a series of presentations. This year, we intend to do the same. Speaking to the teachers across the island, we decided that we were gonna do first something about geographical phenomena. The next thing, within the next 2 to 3 weeks, a different set of teachers will now come on this portal and do something on historical process, because that is where you should be right now in Caribbean Studies. A lot of students are just getting back into the high school mode. Not everyone started school in September. So we're working with that. But we realize also that our sisters and brothers in the Caribbean, they're also interested in what we're doing. So we're gonna have some people from across the region here with us as well. One of the presenters this afternoon is from the Eastern Caribbean, from St. Kitts and Nevis. She teaches at the Colin Fitzbryan College in St. Kitts and Nevis. She's a lecturer, senior lecturer at that. And she's also the Dean of Studies. That's Madame Lavern Brooks Kearns. We have with us also from the Convent of Mercy Academy, Mr. Alex Reid. From the Immaculate Conception High School, we have Mr. Kevin Thompson, who is an author of one of the Caribbean Studies text. And we have Mr. Recardo Valentine, who is also an author of another Caribbean Studies text. I am just the host for today. My name is Christopher Humber. Why put this portal up? I spoke to some members of Key Club Jamaica District who were interested in learning more about Caribbean Studies as they're in the upper sixth form. Some schools do it at upper six, some do it at lower six. But they wanted to learn about Caribbean Studies, see what it's about, see how they could get better grades. And last year it worked for us. So we want to see it improve this year, get some better grades, get the grade ones. We've seen where CXC now is talking about some other things that have been happening, but we'll be watching that as well to see what we can do. Now, we decided not just to use Zoom this year, but to also YouTube this thing so that it can be on YouTube for your own usage some other time. So we're gonna have a series of presenters right at 6:31. I'm going to start with Miss Lavern Brooks Kearns. She is, as I said, a lecturer on this top subject and on Caribbean history and Cape history. So allow me to welcome Madame Lavern Brooks Kearns, all the way from St. Kitts. Ms. Kearns, go ahead.
Mr. Humber, give me 1 minute. Let me fix my business here. Let me go back to the top. You hearing me, Mr. Humber?
Hearing you loud and clear, madam. Giving you all the time. We're letting in all children.
No. I'm good.
Miss Kearns is also a senior marker of Caribbean Studies. So is Mr. Valentine. He's a deputy chief for Caribbean Studies. I do expect today to see the chief of Caribbean Studies on. We welcome all the teachers from across the Caribbean. We welcome all the students from across the Caribbean. I see we're almost at 200. We can host 500 actually. So tell your friends, get everybody on the platform, and let's learn something now. Ms. Kearns, over to you.
And Mr. Humber, you could just say Miss Brooks or Lavern, or Miss Lavern Brooks. You like problem. All right. Good evening to everybody and welcome to another edition of Carib World. And we are hoping that what we have tonight for you, that you will be interested, and we hope that you will stay with us for the duration. So tonight, what we are going to do, we're going to do something on geographical phenomenon. And one of the topics from geographical phenomenon, we are going to be looking at soil erosion and conservation. I know that the flyer said conservation, but before we do conservation, we have to look at what causes soil erosion, what is soil erosion, in order for us to move towards conservation. So I'm hoping that Mr. Humber will not take a half an hour. I'm hoping that I'll be able to get through the slides, that the students will be able to understand, and we will move on. So we start with a quote, and this comes from Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1937. And he said, a nation that destroys its soil, a nation that destroys its soil destroys itself. And you know that our soil is important to us in terms of food security. It is also important to us as a community within the region, so that we will be able to continue, because remember, society, culture, continuity over time. We want to be able to exist. We want to be able to have our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. And when you have your children and great-grandchildren and future generations, that they will be able to have the same access to be able to live in a community and be able to evolve and develop. Now we ask ourselves the question, what is soil erosion? And generally, you could get this definition in any text, but we always say it is the unwanted removal of the soil particles from one area to another, leading to a negative environmental or socio-economic consequences. Remember that soil erosion is actually an environmental disaster. And so students need to be able to distinguish between an environmental disaster and a man-made disaster. And so soil erosion is one of those environmental disasters. And when we talk about environmental disasters, you know, like a hurricane would come in, volcanic eruption, earthquakes, droughts, those would be what we call environmental hazards or environmental disasters. So that is why we move towards defining the whole idea of what is soil erosion. Or we could use another definition, and we could say soil erosion is the detachment, meaning the movement, transport, and the deposition of soil particles on land surface, termed as soil loss. So basically, is your topsoil, it disappears, it moves, and so it creates a problem. And so once that occurs, you know that you have a disaster waiting, basically happening within your community. So if we look at some communities where they have had major soil erosion taking place, and Haiti is a good example of a country where soil erosion is plaguing that community. And so when you read in the text and the study guide, you're going to see where Haiti in particular is featured constantly, as well as Trinidad is featured as part of the communities in the Caribbean, where soil erosion occurs daily within the communities over a period of time. Now, we ask ourselves this question: what happens worldwide? Because we live in a global community, and we say worldwide an estimated
Recording in
26
progress.
Okay, sorry about that. Worldwide, an estimated 25 billion tons of topsoil are washed or blown off, right, of cropland each year. And every year, 6 million hectares of productive dry land becomes desert. And that is a warning to us, especially now that we see that world leaders gathered in Glasgow to discuss the whole idea of environmental problems that are brought on by man. And so what they're saying is that they need to protect the environment. And in order to protect the environment, soil erosion is one of those things that they were concentrating on. They were looking at what was happening in some developing countries, of which the Caribbean is part of the developing world. And so how we use the soil, what we do, and we see over a period of time that we too are affected in terms of soil erosion. Now we ask the question, basically, what is soil? What causes soil erosion? What is the main cause? What are the causes of soil erosion? And we may ask ourselves. And so we are going to look at some broad things, and then we are going to divide them into two subsections. We talk about gravity caused by mass washing away process such as landslide and soil creep down a slope. We see that on hillsides. We see it on gullies. We see it on ravines. We see it every day in our communities where you find that you just see this movement. So you will, for example, those of us who live in St. Kitts, sometimes we are traveling from the west into the east. So we're coming into the city and we see where some areas where the soil comes down on the hillside. So that is what we call the process of whether soil creep, or sometimes you have a landslide, it block roads, could destroy bridges, make roads and other areas impassable. So that is what we talk about when we talk about gravity affecting it. And a lot of times too, you may have tremors, you may have an earthquake, it may be just dislodgement of the soil because it becomes where the vegetation is removed, and so you have serious problems. You may have wind, high winds in particular, loose particles are dislodged and carried by the air and being suspended. And we have seen that in terms of the Sahara dust, and we see how far it reached in the Caribbean over the last month. We have been affected by the Sahara dust in the Caribbean. And so the Sahara dust comes from where the wind takes the dust and bring it across the Atlantic Ocean. And that dust ends up in our communities. And so we ask the question, what is happening to our counterparts in Africa? And then you could also have water, precipitation. It could be long precipitation. It could be just a period of time where you have maybe say 10, 12 inches of rain over a period of time, and it causes the topsoil to wash away, especially if there is no vegetation. So we say particles are dislodged and carried away by the moving surface of water. So if you have a flash flood, if you have hurricane, a tropical flood, a tropical storm, sorry, right? Or just constant precipitation for over a period of time. Then we could have the shoreline, and we see it a lot in a lot of the Caribbean countries where the waves and the tide, the sea level rises and changes occur, and the redistribution of particles. Remember that there are a lot of countries in the Caribbean that are below sea level. Guyana is one of those communities. We see it also in St. Kitts, where Bastia is below sea level. We see it in areas in Trinidad like Maruga and Guayaguayari, and so in those areas where the soil and the sea meet, and we see what happens. What we also recognize in other countries is that the same thing occur in some of these countries across the Caribbean region. So when we talk about the causes, and then we have what we call anthropical genetic, where man through his activities can remove the soil particles. For example, slash and burn. Everybody know what is slash and burn. If you do history or if you do agricultural science, you see where persons basically burn down forested areas or vegetative areas, and then you proceed to remove the rest of the shrubs in a manner that exposes the topsoil. You could have overgrazing, that is where you put animals for a long period of time on the same area of land and they eat all the vegetation. Sometimes you see the animals there and they're actually just picking at what is left. The entire topsoil is exposed from overgrazing. Then you have bulldozing, and a lot of times you see it on hillsides, on mountainous areas where persons, whether they collect aggregate for construction, or you're going to build maybe a road or you're doing some kind of construction and you bulldoze the hillside. And so when you have rain or wind, all of that end up coming down and end up in roads, making them impassable. And this is supposed to be the making of charcoal, right? So I'll make that correction. The making of charcoal. You find that persons cut down the vegetation to burn coal so that they can, sometimes it's for fuel, sometimes it's to make a living. And so in some countries, you find that that is a major problem. In Haiti, what you find is that they use the vegetation for fuel. They don't really make charcoal. They just use the wood for fuel. In small countries in the OECS, you find that persons now, they engage in the production of charcoal. So we cut down and we want the hardy vegetation that covers the land that prevents soil erosion. And so we use those, we cut down the areas and we use it to make our charcoal. And then you have deforestation. Deforestation basically means you remove the vegetation from the land and you left it bare and fallow. Now, we are going to put them into two categories. One is where we talk about human-induced factors or natural factors. So if we were to go further in depth, when we talk about the whole idea of natural factors, heavy rain on weak soil. So if you have constant rainfall, sometimes in the Caribbean, we just have this constant precipitation because of where we live, where we originate. And so the raindrops, they fall on the soil because there is no vegetation. They loosen the soil particles and then they transport the water, the soil downhill, or sometimes from a mountain area. It ended up, the soil basically end up in an area where it has to be removed. And sometimes they just dump the soil in areas where you cannot use it. So the heavy rains basically cause the soil to wash away. Then we talk about vegetation depleted by drought. You would have seen that we have had, over the last 30 years, we have had droughts across the Caribbean region. In 2008, we had a drought for about maybe about 3 years. Then we find that in the last 6 years, we have had a drought for about 2 years, a constant drought where basically where we could not really grow vegetation in its natural habitat. And so the raindrops on the leaf are free to hit the soil, causing erosion in terms of during the rainfall, or sometimes the wind would blow away the particles during a drought. And sometimes you come home and you look at your table or you look at your floor, and then sometimes you sweep up the floor and you realize, where all this stuff's coming from? That is during periods of drought where the soil is loose, and because it is loose, it ends up coming into your home. Sometimes, you clean for the entire a week, couple days, and then you have to go back and clean. And all of that dust has to do with the vegetation depletion due to a drought, and it leads to soil erosion. It may seem small, but over a period of time, it amounts to basically a natural disaster. You may have steep slopes And on the steep slopes, gravity will pull harder. So a lot of the areas in our communities, especially like in the Windward Islands, in areas where you have mountains or hillsides, what you find is that as the water flow, it basically causes soil creep, or it causes what we call a landslip or a slump downhill. And so sometimes the roads are blocked, sometimes causeways are blocked. Sometimes you may be living in a community where you have to go off the main, as we just say, off the beaten track, and you find that these areas are blocked. And so that is also the cause of because of soil erosion. So the steep slope, basically, the soil comes down and creates a problem. We say sudden climate change, and we know that we are suffering from what we call climate change. And so within our communities, what we have seen is the impact of climate change. And we have seen that storms are becoming more frequent, more vicious. And so you find that rainfall over a period of time, even outside the rainy season, during the hurricane season, you find that more rainfall or more precipitation is possible. And so the erosion increases unexpectedly, rapidly as rainstorms become more severe. And we see that, we saw that over in St. Kitts for last month and in September, where for an entire 2 weeks, we had constant rainfall. And what we saw was a lot of the dry rivers were running, and when they ran, you saw soil coming down in the dry rivers. So that is a major issue that we are facing. And so because of climate change, the soil erosion has accelerated. Then we talk about a drought where water dries up and the soil becomes basically bare and fallow. And so you find that the organisms die, the biodiversity dies, the vegetation dies. And so if you have rainfall or if you have high winds, the soil also is removed. So it causes major damage to to soil that would have once been covered. Changes in wind, areas periodically sheltered becomes exposed. And that is because lack of vegetation, drought, the wind is high, and so it leads to the movement of the soil particles. Changes in the land, and we talk about deforestation. And deforestation basically is where you remove the vegetation. So you say the land loses its cover and then its soil and biter. Basically, what you have is all the humus, all the matter that would have kept the soil together, that is broken down. And so you find that there is no moisture, the soil is loose, and you have soil erosion. Landscaping, and a lot of us love the idea of landscaping. We want to see manicured lawns. We want to make sure that our lawn look pretty, but that in itself leads to soil erosion. And so you find that a lot of times on these hillsides, also on some plains, people go and they cut down a lot of the vegetation because they want to see this beauty, and they hire people and they cut down all of these trees. And so what you have is that you carve up the land and you end up having soil erosion in gullies and ravines. They wash down to the sea or in rivers, and the land is lost. Now, if we talk about the human factor, so we move from natural factors to human factors. We're talking about housing development, and we see it across the region where the populations are increasing, and increasingly governments need to clear land to develop, build houses so that persons would have shelter. And so you find that major projects in terms of building what we call projects in terms of home building, high-rise building. And so because of that, because we have to now go and do construction in terms of housing development, you have this massive earthwork in terms of landscaping, removing soil for construction. And so the soil is lost. And a lot of times when they do these construction, they don't use the soil that they remove and try and put it back after the construction. You see large trucks come, they fill up the trucks, they dump it somewhere else. The soil is lost in the process. Then you have road construction, and you notice in the Caribbean, we are building airports, we are building highways, we are building massive construction in terms of roads are taking place across the region. When you look at development in the region, one of the ways to develop a community is the construction of roads. And so governments are now going into virgin lands and they're cutting down trees, they are moving the soil. And so these massive earthworks leaving behind large chunks of hillsides and mountainous areas behind. And so what you find is that they don't remember that they have to take care of these areas that they would have interfered with or they would have removed soil behind. And then when rainfall fall, you find that they flow into the roads, they cover up the roads, they move the rest of the topsoil. And so you find that we end up with serious problems within our society because of construction, whether for homes or for roads. Now we talk about overgrazing. And overgrazing, anytime you hear the term overgrazing, think about animals, where large numbers of animals.
Recording stopped. Recording in progress.
Remove the vegetation, so the animals just graze and graze. And a lot of times, it is ruminants that they put on these lands, whether they be sheep, goats, whether they be cattle, horses, and you know that these animals could graze for hours. And then they just go and they lie down and you see them chewing the cud. But what we are saying is that sometimes they're tied there for maybe a week, 2 weeks. And when you return, not even a stub of vegetation can be seen. And so that in itself leads to the exposure of the topsoil. And so whether wind or rain removes the topsoil in the process because of overgrazing. We talk about intensive farming practices, and this intensive farming practices, you know that we no longer think in terms of subsistence farming. A lot of farmers in the Caribbean are now moving towards what we will call surplus farming. And so they buy machinery because a lot of farms are mechanized. Only if you have a small family farm, you may find that in most cases, some people may continue to use certain methods. But in large farms, intensive farming or agricultural practices takes place. So you buy a plow and you run the plow across the field, you break up the topsoil, right? And what you do, you expose the topsoil. Then you use fertilizer because you want to make sure that your crops are ready for market, that they have no insect bites. You want to make sure that people will buy your produce. So you use a lot of fertilizers to make sure that you yield a lot of crops. The irrigation also, you know, people don't use drip, they use spray. And so that in itself causes the soil to wash away. And so often the soil is washed away permanently in some of these communities. And so we need to recognize that for us as a people, we need to pay attention as to what is happening within our society. And we may ask ourselves the question, when soil erosion occurs, what really is happening? What is the effects of soil erosion? And we need to understand that when soil erosion occurs, you have the removal of the nutrients. The land decreases its yield, so it impacts on farmers. So the land may not be useful again. You may have flooding in the lowland area, and because of heavy rains, you may have a landslide, you may have mudslides. And remember, when you have a landslide or mudslide, it could have serious consequences, socioeconomic consequences, where you end up losing your life, you lose your animals, you could lose your property. So there are serious consequences as it relates to soil erosion. But there are some ways in which we as a people, what we can do is try and conserve what we have. And so we move into the major meat of the matter, and this is where we talk about soil conservation. And so we ask ourselves, what is soil conservation? And we say it is the process whereby measures are adopted or implemented or recommended to prevent soil erosion. These measures can be either through engineering, where you alter the gradient of the land, or it could be through agronomics, incorporating good farming practices and vegetation, and you could use policies and regulations. So there are different ways in which, and so we are going to look at some of these policies that we can adopt, or some of these measures that we can adopt in terms of soil conservation. What we do, we talk about terracing, and generally when we talk about terracing, we are talking about cutting slopes into steps so that it would break the flow of water. So if you look at this picture, you will see where it's on basically on a gradient. You're not seeing it as good as you would see it on this slide. This is where this occurs a lot of times in some countries where they're able to effectively do the terracing method. So if you look at this slide, you will see that you control the runoff. So instead of the water just coming straight down, it goes in steps, so it breaks the flow of water. And so because it breaks the flow of water, it prevents soil erosion. So what you have basically is that the topsoil is not wasted, or the topsoil is not removed. So terracing is one of the ways in which most persons, especially when you plant vegetation that that is fragile, terracing tend to be a much better way. So you see, it is practiced like in places like the Dominican Republic. In Haiti, you see it. You also see it in parts of Trinidad. You see it in St. Kitts in like the Farms Mountain or Surgeries, where they plant a lot of crops. I've seen it also in St. Vincent, and also in parts of Dominica and Grenada. And so you find that they use these as a way of preventing soil erosion. Another way is crop rotation, right? You don't plant the same thing all the time. And so you use to keep the crops from depleting the soil, right? If you plant the same crops year after year, it exhausts the soil, you lose your nutrients, right? So what you do, your certain crops, because of their roots, because of the way they are, they provide nutrients to the soil. So you find that legumes, this should be soy. I don't know how that got there. Sorry. So soy, beans, peas, etc. So legumes mainly, they're able to replenish the nutrients. And so a lot of times when you plant all of these crops, what you try to do is to maintain, the nutrients in the soil. So you use cover crops to maintain. So if we look at crop rotation, so we created a little table. So we say in the first year, roots, second year, leaves, third year, fruits, and we rotating. So that is what we mean. So if you look at the diagram, you plant carrots, then you plant legumes, then you go back to your dark green leafy. So you get the necessary nutrients, whether it be nitrates, phosphorus, that are necessary for the growth of plant life in the process. Then we talk about riprap. This is a term that is used generally where you're using loose boulders to protect the shoreline by waves or tidal impact. A lot of times when you see this, you tend to see it more when there is major construction. So in St. Kitts, you see it, of course, on Port Zante. It was happening also on the Frigate Bay area. You see it when you're going towards the airport in Jamaica. You see it in other countries where they have done major construction, especially on the shorelines. They build hotels. So that is a way of preventing soil erosion. So you basically, what it does, it prevents the impact. So it breaks the impact of the waves, slow down the process, and prevent soil erosion from occurring, so you don't eat into the land and create further problems. Then we talk about contouring. This is where you go around. Anytime you hear the term contour plowing, right? So you use a plow along the contours of the hill or the slope rather than up and down vertically, because that would cause soil erosion, right? So you break the flow of the runoff water while the latter produces rings to increase the runoff. So a better example, if you look at this, this is what we talk about contour plowing. You see it more on large farms like in Guyana, you know, like in the Rupununi savannas and in within the interior where people produce large intensive farms over a period of time. So you see those in the area. And remember, this slide will be shared with your teacher, so you will be able to get the slide. Then we could talk about no-till farming. And when we talk about no-till farming, some people also refer to it as conservation tillage. You know, it's a way of growing crops from year to year without disturbing the soil through tillage. So you talk about non-till farming, the soil is left intact and the crop, basically, the crop residues are left in the field. What you find, there are variations in terms of this method and include working the soil with attention to be paid, attention paid to keeping the soil compact, right? So that you don't lose your carbon. The carbon that is lost is minimal. What you find is that it is used a lot in Central America, especially in Belize, right? Where you basically try as much as possible to minimize the space between the crops. So these are some examples of what you would see when you do what we call no-till farming. So you basically try as much as possible to prevent the what we call aeration of the soil, to prevent the soil from moving. And then you have strip cropping. It's a method of farming used when the slope is too steep or too long, or when other types of farming may not prevent soil erosion. So you find that this is an example of strip cropping, right? Where you plant different types of vegetation at the same time. So you plant what we will call, you may plant corn, you might plant peppers, you might plant lettuce, you may plant cucumber, right? And so you grow different crops at the same time. So you call it strip cropping. We have windbreakers. And when we talk about the whole idea of a windbreaker or a shelter belt, usually it is made up of more rows of trees. And so you find that they're planted in such a manner that it prevents the wind from actually blowing away the much more fragile vegetation. And so it also helps to prevent soil erosion, because it means that what you find is that these trees are planted around the edges of the farm. So it prevents soil erosion in the process. This is an example of what we call windbreakers. This is how it is done. A lot of times you find it in terms of like maybe sugarcane, in terms of coffee, cocoa. You know, you try as much as possible to help to prevent basically the trees between the fields to break or reduce the force of the wind. I saw that on a banana plantation also, where it was used to protect the bananas from strong winds. Then we could have what we call agroforestry. And when we talk about agroforestry, where you have basically farming in the forest without disturbing or clearing the land. So you have this canopy above, right? It breaks the flow of the water, and then you plant the more fragile crops. And so you have within that, you find that you're able to produce, and so more crops over a period of time. Then you have what we call stubble mulching. Those who of you who do agricultural science, you would hear about mulching in most cases. And basically what you have is the residue from the last crop are used as mulch. The mulch helps to keep the soil together. Basically, they stand together, and what it does, it conserves moisture and prevent the soil from washing away or being blown away. And thus the term that you use called stubble mulching. So this is what you see generally in terms of stubble mulching. And then we ask the question finally, can soil conservation work? And we need to recognize that it can work. We just need the will, political will. We need persons to practice soil conservation. And so we say people with few economic options cannot. And Haiti is a good example where you have to survive. In some communities, you have to operate as though you have to survive. And therefore, they continue to do deforestation or deforest to get fuel. And they also continue to use insufficient farming practices because some people cannot afford on hillsides as is typically the only land they have access to. For instance, we talk about Haiti, you go to the textbook and you will see in the book Caribbean Studies and Interdisciplinary Approach, page 33. And then you talk about the wealthy will continue with their construction project, timber industry, tourism development activities like hotel construction. So both the poor and the wealthy impacts on how conservation will occur. And finally, you have your references. So we have our references that you can look at and do more reading. So we have come to an end. I think this is a mouthful. We have had a mouthful thus far. Mr. Humber?
Thank you, Ms. Brooks, for such a great presentation on soil erosion and soil conservation. We'll now move on in our series and we'll have Mr. Alex Reid looking at the other side of geographical phenomena. So when Ms. Brooks takes down her presentation, then we'll have Mr. Alex Reid looking at volcanic eruptions and plate tectonics. Mr. Reid, over to you now.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Humber. Good evening, everyone. As Mr. Humber said, my name is Alex Reid, and we will be spending the next 15 or so minutes, 15, 20 minutes, looking at the impact of geographical phenomena on the Caribbean region, but we will zero in on the volcanoes. So we'll be looking at volcanic eruptions, and particularly La Soufrière that erupted earlier this year. So first, before we get into volcanoes, we have to find out what causes these this natural environmental occurrence. So looking at plate tectonics, there's a image on your left with the major plates in the world. You can see the Caribbean plate, the small plate in the middle right here, surrounded by major plates such as the North Atlantic plate, the South American and Cocos plates. So plate tectonics is the theory supported by a wide range of evidence that consider the Earth's crust and upper mantle to be composed of several large, thin, relatively rigid plates that move relative to one another. So in other words, the Earth's surface, the Earth's surface is not a continuous layer. So it is broken up into many small or large pieces, the lithosphere that is, and these are called crustal plates or tectonic plates, and you can see them here on your left. These large segments of the crust and the upper mantle float on the denser semi-molten rock beneath them and move very slowly across the surface of the planet. So each of the plates move only a few centimeters in a year. So we're on the Caribbean plate now. It is moving, but it's not moving fast. We're not feeling it, but it moves a couple centimeters each year. The movement affects all of us, and one of the ways is volcanoes. So plate tectonics can be described as a study of crustal plates and how their movement affects the Earth's surface. And they affect the Earth's surface in many ways. Volcanoes are just one, but it can affect us through earthquakes, for example. I know earthquakes can also cause tsunamis, for example. So let's zero in further on the Caribbean plate. And you're seeing it here, the Cocos plate to the southwest, the North American plate in the north, and the South American plate in the south. I made a joke. I don't know if you find it funny with my students that the Earth is like a pot of dumplings, and the pressure being built up because of the heat causes the dumplings to float. If you watch the pot, you notice that the dumplings are tussling with each other, and they float, and some might submerge others based on the lightness of the dumpling or not. So it is a similar phenomenon with plate tectonics, where heat from the center of the Earth causes the surface to shift and shuffle, and so the lighter plates, emerge above the heavier plates. All right, so let's look at the Caribbean plate in relation to the other plates. There are three relational plates to the Caribbean. You have a convergent plate boundary, and this is the Atlantic plate here being subducted by the Caribbean plate. So if you look to the north, specifically to the east, you'll see where they are moving towards each other. And what happens as a result of them moving towards each other is that the heavier plate, which is the oceanic plate, is being submerged by the lighter Caribbean plate. Then you also have the divergent plate boundary, where you see here the mid Cayman spread at the center. And you have a transform plate boundary, which is the South American plate in relation to the Caribbean plate. The Atlantic plate is being subducted by the Caribbean plate, and the Lesser Antilles is formed as a subduction zone, basically. You can see here some of the activities recorded as a result of this movement in the Caribbean plate. So you can see Soufriere Hills, 1995, that's Montserrat, Guadeloupe in 1976, Montpellier in 1902, Soufriere a series of time before 2021, it erupted in 1979, and Kikimjeni in Grenada, which is a submerged volcano, underwater volcano. Got the three plate margins that were mentioned. Let's first look at the divergent plate margins. So these type of margins, at these times, two plates are moving apart, so they diverge from each other directions. And the convection currents, you see the magma beneath the plates move in opposite direction, and this is caused, of course, as you mentioned, by the intense heat of the Earth's interior. And of course, this moves the two mantles apart. As these plates move apart, this leaves cracks and fissures, lines of weakness that allow magma from the mantle to escape from the highly pressurized interior of the planet. So there's an opening, so the magma bursts forth. Here you're seeing an example of this, which is the Mid-Atlantic Ridge running through Iceland. If you know Iceland, they have frequent earthquakes. They have frequent eruptions, are always on the look and waiting on the next eruption. So the magma fills the gap and eventually erupts onto the surface and cools as new land. So new land is formed when these plates diverge. So this can create huge ridges of undersea mountains and volcanoes, such as the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And where these mountains poke above the level of the sea, islands are created. Both earthquakes and volcanoes can result at these margins, and the earthquake caused by the movement of earthquakes are caused by the movement of the magma through the crust. Then you also have transform plate margins, and these occur when plates slide or perhaps move accurately, perhaps more accurately, grind past each other along transform faults. So they're not pushing up against each other, nor are they pulling apart. They are sliding past each other. So the relative motion of the two plates is either sinistral, so the left side towards the observer, or dextral, right side towards the observer. And the San Andreas Fault in California is an example of this type of plate, and you'll see a picture of that briefly. But if we can remember, earlier this year, there was a 7-point-something magnitude earthquake off the coast of Jamaica. That was as a result of a transform plate margin. So here you're seeing the San Andreas Fault in California, where two plates are sliding past each other. And of course, California is known for its earthquake activity. Then we have the convergent plate margins. And if you look at the picture to your right, the one in the center best depicts the situation of Lassifer, the Lesser Antilles, the Eastern Caribbean island chains. So at these margins, two plates move or converge together, and the destruction of some of the Earth's crust result. An oceanic plate, so in our case, the Atlantic plate, is pushed towards a continental plate. We'll call the Caribbean plate this. It is lighter and it is less dense. So as a result, the lighter plate moves on top or stays on top. The oceanic plate, which is the Atlantic plate, is pushed under the continental plate in what is called a subduction zone, creating a deep ocean trench, and it is the oceanic crust which sinks down into the mantle because it is heavier. As it descends, friction, increasing pressure, and heat from the mantle melts the plate. So as you can see here, it is being subducted, and the heat, the grinding of the two plates causes one to melt, the subducted plate to melt, and magma is created. So some of this molten rock material can work its way up through the continental crust through fissures. And this is a perfect example of the Lesser Antilles, the island chains. On the right is an example of the Atlantic Ocean plate, the Atlantic plate, and on the left is an example of the Caribbean plate. So you see one is sliding under the other, one is lighter than the other. So this is often some distance from the margin where the magma can eventually reemerge at the surface to create a range of mountains. You can see the range of mountains being created there from the friction of the two being pushed together. And as the movement of the plates grinding past each other can create earthquakes. So zeroing in on Lassifer, there are 4 types of volcanoes. There are 4 types of volcanoes. Can I please? Is that Ian? All right, so there are 4 types of volcanoes: lava domes, composites, cinder cones, and shields. And based on the material which makes up the volcano. So in addition, volcanoes are classified according to their levels of activity. So active volcanoes are the ones which erupt or show signs of eruption on a regular basis. Then you have the dormant volcanoes, which are the sleeping ones, which have not erupted for a very long time, but have signs of grumbling. And then you have the extinct ones, which are those that have not erupted for centuries. So they practically died out. The Caribbean itself, the Caribbean region, is a part of the belt of volcanic activity in the world. And there are many evidences of volcanic activity in the region. Of course, fresh in our mind is Lasso Frere in April of this year. It erupted, as I mentioned earlier, last in 1979 before now, Mount Kele in 1902, and Montserrat in 1995. In addition to these, there are many evidences of volcanism, such as Crater Lake in Grenada, volcanic plugs in St. Lucia, which send out steam and gases and sulfur dioxide, and these can be found in St. Lucia and Dominican. We look at them some more briefly. So I'm sure we are familiar with these pictures by now. On the left, every day we were updated as the new lava dome grew. And then eventually, on the 9th of April, Lasso Frere erupted for the first time since 1979. All right, so it erupted. And we were watching the news, we were keeping abreast of the situation. Those of us who had friends in Eastern Caribbean were calling and finding out what was happening, Some of us who had friends in St. Vincent, were keeping, just watching every day, trying to find out what was happening. Quite a few persons would have left the island and gone elsewhere. So there are many negative impacts of volcanoes. So let's look at as much as them as possible. So an example is the loss of lives. Montserrat, for example, quite a few persons died in that eruption in 1995. Sticking with Montserrat, there were about 13,000 people living on that island prior to the volcanic eruption, 1994. The census counted about 13,000 people. In 2021, there are about 6,000 people living there. So the island has not been repopulated to post eruption numbers. And this is how many years later? Over 20 years later. A lot of them were displaced. A lot were evacuated to the United Kingdom. Of course, families broke up, neighborhoods broke up. There was a loss of culture. There was psychological stress. So, for example, they said Lasso Frere eruption, a lot of people would have been staying in shelters. There was loss of privacy. Of course, that's not comfortable. So think about the psychological, not just the physical issues, but the psychological issues associated with it. Speaking of displacement again, some persons have moved for good. Some persons will not come back to the shadows of that volcano. So whole communities have been displaced. Then there's pollution due to contaminated water supply by ash, dirt, and gases. And POW, the Pan American Health Organization, released a newsletter in the aftermath of that volcanic eruption, warning against diseases like gastrointestinal impacts and other waterborne diseases. Then you also have poisonous gases released into the atmosphere. It can result in respiratory illnesses, asthma for those who are troubled with asthma, bronchitis. It can irritate the eye. It can irritate the nose. It can irritate the skin. There's no escaping it when the ash starts to fall. Then there's also mud flow. A couple of days after the eruption, rain started to fall, and there was just thick rivers of mud, ash, volcanic ash and water mixed together, almost sludge-like, flowing through the streets of St. Vincent and destroying everything in its wake. So destruction of property, think about the impact that it has on small island developing states, on our governments that do not have the fiscal capacity to rebuild after these natural disasters. So it impacts our budgets, and we have to seek foreign aid in order to recover from these things. The mud flows also destroy vegetation. So for example, banana takes a couple months. You plant the banana and it takes a couple months for it to mature, and you reap that investment. If it is destroyed, you'd have to wait. You've lost all of that, and you'd have to wait a couple more months, after replanting. So it retards the economy and pushes the economy back a couple months. Then there are changes in weather due to clouds of ash, which decrease the amount of sunlight reaching the earth. So even as far as Barbados, there are pictures of Barbados at midday. You could hardly, Michaela, you could hardly see 100 feet in front of you, 100 feet in front of you at midday. And of course, there's increasing cost of living because things get scarce. So what usually happens is that, some of us are familiar with the term price gouging takes place. People are in need of food, people are in need of water. And so merchants raise the cost because they know people will have to buy it. So those are some of the negative impacts. What are some of the positive impacts? So there are valuable minerals that can be unearthed by magma. Guyana is an example where after they're still reaping the rewards of mineral deposits. Long ago, they don't have any active volcanoes anymore. But specifically in countries like Dominica, the Commonwealth of Dominica, pumice rock is one of their main exports, and it is the chief building material. So the people in the Commonwealth of Dominica capitalize on volcanic rock, the volcanic rock called pumice rock. Then it creates good farming soil from weathered volcanic rocks. So for example, the slopes on Mount Misery in St. Kitts is known for its rich soil content. And so there are a lot of farmers who settle in that area. Then there are hot springs, which are potential for thermal energy in countries such as St. Lucia and Dominica. And there are also tourist hotspots. As you can see, some tourists here are taking a mud bath in one of the sites, at one of the sites. They become major tourist attractions in St. Lucia, and as we mentioned earlier, Boiling Lake in Dominica. We mentioned the pumice rock export also. One of the positives also is that it creates a consciousness among Caribbean people as to the threat of natural disasters. So you're more aware. So if you know that if you see signs of eruption, if you hear that the volcano looks active, you start to put things in place, you start to prepare, you start to plan your emergency routes. The government itself will start to prepare emergency shelters, plan emergency routes, etc. Deploy the army, deploy Red Cross, those who are tasked with first response. There's an increased emphasis on mitigation. So the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Response Agency, for example, is tasked with responding to Caribbean countries in need. And also, natural disasters cause governments to enforce building codes to mitigate against the effects of earthquakes and other natural disasters. So the picture to the right is Plymouth, which was the capital of Montserrat. And this was Plymouth after the 1995 eruption. You see, everything is now gray. The entire capital was destroyed. And so they did not rebuild there. They rebuilt north of the island of Montserrat and avoided, they declared that entire area to the south of the volcano a disaster zone. So they're conscious that if we repeat our mistakes, we'd have to go spend money, which, or the Caribbean governments have limited fiscal flexibility. There is a potential loss of lives. Quite a few lives were lost in the Plymouth example also. So we develop a consciousness of the impacts of volcanoes, of the impacts of geographical phenomena and natural disasters overall. And if we prepare for them, then we're better able to mitigate and reduce the risks of loss of lives, loss of property, and make these instances more educational, so we can talk about them in a Caribbean Studies forum instead of counting the loss of lives and property and waiting 5 years to bounce back from these naturally occurring phenomena that we cannot avoid. All right, so that was my last slide. Mr. Humbo.
Thank you, Mr. Alex Reid, teacher at Convent of Mercy. We will now hand over to Amelia, who will do the transition before the next speaker. We have to do a transition break right here for our sponsors so we can actually transition to the next speaker. Amelia, over to you now. In the meantime, do we have any questions for the two speakers before? Ladies and gentlemen, any questions from the teachers or the students in the audience for the two speakers? I realize a lot of people are leaving now. We have moved from 360 to 313. We're not done yet. The best is yet to come. How to answer questions in Cape Caribbean Studies is to come, both multiple choice and essay questions. And what is required? A question from Simone Lam, Mr. Reid and Ms. Brooks. Question from Simone Lam. Go ahead, Simone Lam.
Thank you, sir. It's Simon. I wanted to know, when it comes to the volcanoes and soils, what kind of questions can we expect? Are they going to be 30-mark questions? Are they going to be 20-mark questions? And how are they going to be phrased?
We're going to be doing that in the next session. We're going to be doing that in the next session coming along just in a few minutes. Our technical team is just getting everything ready. So you'll get that presenter presenting on both 20 and 30-mark questions. Shania Williams, go ahead.
Good evening, Mr. Christopher. I heard that the volcano is also good for crops, like people can plant their crops there because the soil is very good.
It's rich soil, yes, you're correct, but it's also dangerous practice to actually be planting in the shadows of a volcano. You reap a lot, but if the volcano erupts, you're gonna lose everything. We have seen that in Montserrat, below the Soufriere Hills. We have seen that in St. Vincent. St. Vincent was a major banana farming country, and it was a major, what you call, they shipped a lot of bananas to Europe. Make you aware of it. Yes, it's a major farming community that they have on the foothills of that volcano, but they lost it after the eruption. But it is actually rich soil to plant on. You're correct. Naja James from the Holy Childhood High School.
Good evening, sir. This question is actually a debate I had with my geography teacher back in 5th form.
Recording in
those
progress.
citizens that came here, some of them decided to attend our schools. Some, yeah.
Sir, you're muted.
Yeah, as I tell you, technical situation. My technician is doing a lot of things behind the scenes. Yeah. So they came to Jamaica, so it brought a lot of Montserratans here. I have a lot of friends in Jamaica who are from Montserrat, and they're actually here right now working. But I also have
You're muted again, Ms. Omba.
Yes, sorry about that. But as I said, the technicians are behind the scenes, so I don't know what's happening. Yeah, all my screen behind me is gone, so when I'm off, I'll have to do that again. But anyhow, I know that it split up a lot of families. I'm giving you my personal experience. So it can be a good effect and a bad effect on individuals and on communities, because I've seen that personally already. Like I said, with the Montserrat issue, I've made a lot of friends. There are people in Kiwanis clubs who I know who are from Montserrat. They live here actually, but they visit. But I know some people who went to England, so it broke up some families. Now, Mr. Reid and Ms. Brooks, you can go ahead and add your answers to this.
All right, thank you, Ms. Omba. Yes, I agree with the young lady from Holy Child. I see us coming together on two levels. On a technical level, and I spoke about it in in terms of the Caribbean Disaster Emergency and Response Agency, which is SIDERA. So there's technical cooperation where whenever there's a natural disaster, not just hurricanes, hurricanes, volcanoes, but hurricanes, earthquake, whatever it is. There are technical experts from each island that comes together and responds to a particular crisis. So they would have done so with St. Vincent, for example. I know people, professionals in Jamaica that responded in the aftermath of the Lasso eruption to help to rebuild, St. Vincent. But we're also plagued in the Caribbean with insularity. So I understand the question and the debate, the angle of the debate. We are an insular people, but whenever these things happen, there is some level of sympathy and interest in the well-being of the other. So you found that, for example, in St. Vincent, I am sure I recall that other islands, neighboring islands, were taking in even students that were on the eve of sitting their CSEC examinations. They were given preferential treatment by the neighboring islands to take them in and get them settled and have them prepare for their exams, and not stress about what was happening in St. Vincent. So yes, it creates a level of unity and camaraderie amongst Caribbean people that we don't usually see, outside of these unfortunate situations.
Ms. Brooks, anything to say before Mr. Thompson comes on?
What I would say basically is that in relation to the discussion, remember that there in relation to Caribbean studies, there is no wrong answer, there is no right answer. It is how you analyze the point that you're going to make. So when she talk about basically bringing us together, we have to look at it in terms of the whole idea, whether SIDERA or using forces from around the region. So for example, the RSS is also deployed if you have a natural disaster to help keep the peace, and that in itself also brings with it a certain level of cooperation, technical cooperation. Then we have to look at it through the issue of CARICOM, as well as the OECS responding to their neighbors. showing a certain level of support and solidarity whenever we have a natural disaster or an environmental disaster. And so we have always responded as neighbors, despite our differences, we have always responded. However, we need to recognize that in the last time when we had a natural disaster, major natural disaster, we were also suffering from the impact of COVID. And so some Caribbean countries could not respond the way they would have liked to in relation to the St. Vincent situation. And not only that, some persons decided, I am not moving and going anywhere. If I'm going to die of COVID, let me die in my home rather than leave and go. So when you have a situation where you have a natural disaster and a pandemic, you know, there is that you have to weigh your options as to what will happen and how it would happen and how governments respond and the way in which they respond. So it could be twofold. And so it is the way in which you discuss the point and the examples that you use and the jargon that is used will determine the marks that you get, right?
Ms. Brooks, before you go and we have the other presenter, I see Joanne Miller with a question. We'll take this last question because we don't want to keep everybody up too long. So Mr. Miller, go ahead.
Miss, what are the main causes of a volcanic eruption? And most Caribbean countries have dormant volcanoes. So is there any way to make an active volcano dormant?
Volcanic eruption is a natural disaster. It isn't something that you can predict. Sometimes, depending on monitoring, you can say that the possibility exists that there might be a volcanic eruption. The monitoring of the La Sofia volcano in St. Vincent, they were able to predict that the possibility exists that it would erupt, and so it prevented the loss of life. I don't think anybody could cause an eruption, a volcanic eruption, because it is a natural disaster. Most of the volcanoes in the Caribbean are active. They're not dormant. Even though you may have a volcano and they say it has not erupted for the last maybe say 200, 300 years, the possibility exists that it can erupt. So we cannot say they are dormant. We might just say they're sleeping because the possibility exists that they can become active. And so we have to pay attention. Sometimes scientists say they're extinct. God forbid that we take that to mean that nothing can happen. But remember that the Caribbean is a very volatile and vulnerable area. And because we live in a community where it is very vulnerable, we have to always be on our P's and our Q's. For example, we have had every day in the Caribbean, we have earthquakes, whether they are just tremors, whether they just register 4 point something or 3 point something. Every day we have earthquakes in the Caribbean, and the UE Seismic Center, they tend to put out the stats every day. So any little rumbling, you get an alert from the Seismic Center saying that they would have had an earthquake. Volcanic activity, they're also doing monitoring, and that is one of the ways in which they're able to say that something has happened, whether it be in Kikom, Jenny, maybe as far as Trinidad in the south, right up to Jamaica in the north. So we have to be a bit careful when we talk about dormant volcanoes or extinct volcanoes. The Caribbean is a very active environment, and so we have to just hope and pray for the best.
Mr. Willis, we have two other presenters. Mr. Willis, we have two other presenters. We'll take yours and then we'll go on. Yes, Mr. Willis?
Okay, thank you. Miss, you referred to dormant volcanoes and stated that if they haven't been active for 200, 300 years, but there's still the probability that it will happen. Isn't that the definition of dormant and not active?
No. because St. Kitts has a dormant volcano. But at the same time, when you go in the crater, you see activity, you have warm water, you see geothermal activity taking place, but it has not erupted since I think was the 1700s. That doesn't necessarily mean that it is just dormant. In most cases, there are veins from the volcano that leads into the sea, and you see the activity from that. So even though the crater itself, there is no major activity taking place, remember that these things, and they could wake up at any time. So in St. Vincent, it was dormant for a while. 1979, it erupted. We see the mud volcano. Generally, it's just bubbles happening. And then you sometimes you have this major flare up. So we have to be extremely careful when we talk about dormant, right? And a seismologist and a geologist will tell you that in terms of monitoring, there is activity. There is activity, no matter how slight it is, there is activity.
So does that mean dormant refers to the state of when it's not active for a long period of time, but once it erupts, it's no longer dormant?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what it means.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan Willis. We'll now move to our third presenter of the evening. He will look at coral reefs. He will also look at how to answer the essay questions. This third presenter is acting as the head of department at the Immaculate Conception High School. He's an author of a renowned Caribbean Studies textbook, which most of you use in your schools. I should actually show you a copy. Mr. Thompson is also a marker for CXC Caribbean Studies. For years, he has been one of the SBA markers. So Mr. Thompson is now going to present to you how to write an essay for Caribbean Studies. Please sit back and enjoy.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. And thank you, Mr. Humber, for inviting me on this platform to share with the students and teachers throughout the Caribbean on how to complete Caribbean Studies essays. The extremely scary Caribbean Studies essays. I know, for example, at my school, we have some of the brightest students in the Caribbean, yet they are extremely fearful of writing essays, some of them, and understandably so. You know, we're dealing with putting a lot of information in one document in a concise manner, you know, so that it makes sense to others reading it in a specified time, limited time. So when we're writing essays, we normally have between 45 to 50 minutes to write an essay, and it can be a daunting task, right? But I'm going to show you today that it is not as difficult as it, you know, would seem for many. As a matter of fact, writing an essay could be fun. And I do believe the essay writing portion of the Caribbean Studies exam is, you know, where students who possibly they're not as prepared as others, you know, on certain topics can actually maximize their marks, right? It's a good place to maximize your marks because for the Caribbean Studies essays, it's not about how much you know, but really about how well you argue and bring across your points. Let me repeat. For the Caribbean Studies essays, it's not about how much you know, but how well you argue and bring across your points. You can study the Jennifer Mohammed or the Collins Revision Guide from page 1 all the way to the end, and you will still be in a bad position in the exam if you have not practiced how to write essays in a concise manner while arguing your points well. All right, so let me begin my presentation. Everybody's in. All right. Now, I am starting off this presentation by basically introducing to some of you already know that there are two mark schemes that are used for the Caribbean Studies essays. You have a 20 marks essay and a 30 marks essay, right? And most of your teachers would have told you that for the 20 marks essays, they're normally explanatory essays asking you to describe, you know, and for the argumentative essays, they are definitely a little bit more complex, you know, and these essays may ask you to outline and explain, etc. Right? Now, there's not much difference in terms of the structure of each essay, right? The general structure of each type of essay is basically the same, but the marks allocated, right, for each skill that is required for the essay, that is where you find the difference, the major difference. Now, on the screen here, you're seeing for the explanatory essay, where you're given or allocated rather 7 marks for knowledge, 8 for use of knowledge, 5 for inquiry and communication, for a total of 20 marks. And for the argumentative essay, it's 10, 12, and 8 for the allocation of marks for the 30 mark essay, sorry, not 20 mark essay. So this is generally how the essays are graded, and this is the general mark scheme that your teachers and of course the CXC markers will use in guiding you, well, not in guiding you, but in marking your essay and giving you a final grade. Now, I must tell you this. I tell my students at all times, do not focus on this breakdown. This breakdown is really for us, markers and teachers, reading and marking your essay, right, to determine how to allocate your marks. What I want my students and you, ladies and gentlemen, to focus on is what is expected of you in writing the essay. Because this can be a bit challenging for a student at the high school level to understand how the marks are allocated for the various sections throughout the essay, right? So I tell my students, do not focus too much on this mark scheme, but rather focus on the instructions given to you by your teacher on how to structure and lay out a proper outline for your essay. Now, I'll have breaks at various points for questions because I want this to be an interactive presentation. All right? All right. So we're looking now at the 20 mark essay criteria, right? And the knowledge section or the content is where you include the relevant points that outline your understanding of all the concepts critical to the discussion and consistently shows the relevance to issues being discussed. Let me give you an example. If you're looking at an essay looking at the value of coral reefs, for example, I'll show you an example of that essay closer to the end of the presentation. For the knowledge aspect, you're being, graded for what you know about coral reefs, right? What you know about, the general positioning of coral reefs or structure of coral reefs, what you know about the benefits to be derived from coral reefs, and what you know of possibly some of the disadvantages of, coral reefs to Caribbean, the Caribbean waters or Caribbean societies. That is the knowledge base of things. For the use of knowledge, right, you're looking at how the information from the knowledge is presented in a sound and coherent discussion. Now notice we're using the word discussion here in 20 mark essays, right? I have students all the time, they ask, why are we still expected to discuss for 20-mark essays when it is asking us to describe? Well, you are in sixth form, ladies and gentlemen, right? And at this level, even if an essay asks you to describe, you're still being graded based on how you properly discuss the points that you present. Because at this level, mere description without explanation and discussion is not acceptable, right? We're talking about CAPE level essays now, right? At the CSEC level, you may be asked to merely state or describe, or outline in a few words your knowledge and information. But at this level, you're always required to discuss the knowledge and information that you present in your essays. All right? Now, for the inquiry and communication section, you're required to demonstrate a sound command of skills necessary to convey meaning. Ideas are clearly sequenced, and ability to manipulate vocabulary, sentence structure, and paragraphing are used to convey ideas effectively. In other words, young ladies and gentlemen, you must have a certain mastery of the English language to write essays well, right? You must have sound communication skills, and certainly it's an important part of the mark scheme for the Caribbean Studies essays. And for the 20-mark essays now, the difference really shows in what the examination body or your teachers are testing. And for 20-mark essays, we're really testing your understanding and application of the information you know on the topic, right? We're testing your understanding and your application of the information that you know on the topic. Now, let me get this, what you'd call misinformation out of the way about, certain topics falling under the 20-mark essay criteria and others falling under 30-mark essay criteria. CXC can decide to give you a 20 or 30-mark essay on any topic that they choose. All right? They can decide to give a 30 or a 20-mark essay on any topic that they choose throughout the syllabus. There's some misinformation out there that, you can't get a 30-mark essay from the geographical phenomenon section of the syllabus. That is not true, right? It can happen. So you have to prepare and practice on writing all sorts of essays on all the different or both different mark schemes that are presented. All right, now the 30-mark criteria. I'm not going to go through knowledge, use of knowledge, and inquiry and communication again for 30-mark essays, but I want you to focus on the testing, what it is testing. Specifically, 30-mark essays are testing your ability to analyze and evaluate the information you know on the topic, to analyze and evaluate the information that you know on the topic, right? So this is an important, or these are important skills for students who are now going off into the wider tertiary education level, right? It's very important for you to understand how to analyze and evaluate information, right? This is where you're now asked to outline impact of one phenomena on a community or on say a country, right? And when we say impact, we're not merely expected to just outline or describe or write on an eventuality or a result, but to outline impact is definitely asking more. And this is what 30-mark essays now will require of you or of the students. So it's what they're really testing for that makes the difference between the 30-mark essay and the 20-mark essay and what your writing focus should really be on. All right? All right. Let's move on to the next slide. All right, so let us look at the writing process. Now, all students have a different approach to writing essays, right? You've all mastered your own approach. Some are successful, others not so successful. It's important to get feedback or take feedback from your teachers who are trying to really help you to understand that for any essay at all, there is a standard approach that generally works for most people. I don't want to call it an all-inclusive approach, but a standard approach that generally works for most people. So for the average student, this is the process that we find really works for most students. All right. And this is a step-by-step approach that we would also like you to try to master and get some feedback from your teacher to see if this is the right approach for you, right? Because there are many ways of writing essays. Now, step one, the first step to writing any essay at all, Caribbean studies, economics, any essay at all, is to read and analyze the question to find out what it is asking of you. To read and analyze the question to find out what it is asking of you. Now, in order to properly analyze an essay question, you must isolate the key terms and phrases that may assist you in understanding and responding to the essay question. Now, you must ensure that you have an introduction that is short and a conclusion, fine, right? And most students need to understand that introductions in the traditional sense of it being a long preamble of the topic is not necessary at this level. An introduction is really starting an essay by outlining the points that you are going to include in that essay, right? You're not giving an elaborate background on the topic. You're not giving the information that you learned on the topic in any order or fashion. You're really jumping right in by defining your key terms and outlining the points that will help you to guide you in writing your essays, and also to keep a certain level of cohesion and uniformity to your essay so that the reader, the marker, can safely look on this essay and say, okay, this student, they have their thoughts. This student, they have their thoughts well organized, very fluid, and of course, the inquiry and communication skills are strong in this young lady or young gentleman. Now, step two, you must determine the points you wish to expound upon in the body of your essay, right? This is an important step. So you're expected for a 20-mark essay to have about 5 points. And of course, for a 30-mark essay, you are expected to have at least 6 points, depending on the essay. So it could be 7, but you must have at least 6 points. Now, I've had students ask if, 4 points, having 4 points, 5 marks each, is adequate for a 20-mark essay. And for most of the essays that my students and myself have gone through during class, we're realizing that no, that's not adequate enough, right? So for a 20-mark essay, I encourage my students to have at least 5 well-organized, well-laid out points. Now for step 3, you should ensure that each point being discussed is supported by examples. And this is something that many students, of course, fail to outline, right, in their essays. Most essays that I have read for certainly the first part of a term in any school year, they're normally void of examples because students feel as if, remembering dates and remembering the names of places, events, people, it's too cumbersome, right? So they write their essays without examples, especially when they're under a bit of pressure. And of course, these examples are needed to support your points, right? You can't write in isolation of examples, because where is the proof that your argument holds water? You must have examples. And in the Caribbean, I know we like to speak in a highfalutin or just in a kind of an abstract fashion. But, you know, I encourage my students, every point they make in class, I encourage them to give examples. For the first part of the term, I usually, you know, if they have a textbook with them, they can look up the example in the textbook, which is fine. We're just getting to familiarize ourselves with the information, just getting to know the information. That's fine. In the exam, you will not have the textbook. So what I suggest, for each of your topics as you go through, you try to identify key points that you need to remember, key events, key individuals, key dates that you must remember so that you can use them as examples in your essays. Now, another misconception that we have in writing essays is that a paragraph must be 4 sentences, right? And I tell my students a well-structured paragraph can have up to, you know, upwards of 7 sentences. I know some English teachers may be fuming. However, I've seen well-written essays where a paragraph will have, you know, between 5 and 7 sentences. Certainly, I don't encourage students to have any more than 7. But, right, write your essays in such a way where your ideas in each paragraph are complete. Do not leave incomplete paragraphs or paragraphs that don't convey fully an idea or a point or even a big part of a point, right, before moving on to the next, because then it can lead to confusion in reading the essay and it can be misinterpreted. And, you know, it can seem as if it's not cohesive and you don't know what you're doing, etc. So you want to ensure that your ideas for each of your points is laid out well in your paragraphs. And for step 4, you need to make sure that you reread your paragraphs as you proceed in the essay. Now, as I said before, everybody will have their own approach. For some students, they will wait until the end of the essay, then they read through the whole essay. I encourage my students to read through as you go along, because this is how you will ensure that your essay is cohesive and that in moving from one point to the next, there's, you know, sort of a flow to things. You don't want your essay to seem disjointed. All right, you want it to have a nice cohesive flow. So you read your paragraphs as you complete them. And also you may find that this is the best thing to do in the interest of time, because at the end of writing your essays, you may not have enough time to read over all 4 of your essays. So I do encourage my students as they go along to just, you know, read their paragraphs to ensure that their ideas are conveyed properly. Now, what is the recommended structure of the essay? And I know by now at 6th form level, we all understand that an essay must have an introduction, must have a body, and you must have a conclusion. All right? So for the introduction, you may state how you're going to answer the question or formulate a thesis statement. If the question requires you to take a position, this is where you may introduce your position. And I normally tell, you know, my less experienced essay writers that this is basically a safe bet. You know, you may introduce your position in the introduction as a safe bet. You may do it in other parts of the essay, like the end or at some point in the body. More skilled essay writers can carry that off and make it flow properly throughout the essay. But for my essay writing beginners, I do tell them, you know, take a slide position at the beginning of your essay. Now for the body, as I said before, 5 points for 20-mark essays and 6 points for 30-mark essays. And you must remember that your paragraphs must be structured in a particular way. Now again, for those of you not well experienced in writing essays, this is the safe way to structure your paragraphs. I'm not saying it is the only way. It is the safe way. So you must introduce your point or the point you're trying to make. That's the first thing you do in a paragraph when you're writing an essay. And the introduction of the point must be followed by specifics and details providing explanations and justifications, right? And this is called the discussion of your point. This is where you discuss your point in step 2, right? And for step 3 now, you must support it with relevant examples. All essay points must have relevant examples, right? Practical examples, relevant examples, factual examples, right? And in your conclusion, which is what we call the ending part or the tail end of the essay, you can have a summary of the points. You can have a summary of the points, not meaning you're writing the points all over again, right? But just give a brief overall summary. And for some people, you can actually introduce your position in the paragraph, in the conclusion, in the concluding paragraph. I don't normally advise this, right? What I advise for most, the average student, is for you to rephrase or emphasize your position in the conclusion, using, of course, this summary to show, okay, these points overwhelmingly support my position, right? So you can emphasize your position in the conclusion of the essay. All right, I hope you're understanding so far. Let me take a break. Any questions from among our students or teachers? Any questions at all? Let me hear you, young ladies and gentlemen. Any questions? Simon Lam. Go ahead, Simon.
How many questions is a good conclusion? Can it be 1 sentence or 2 sentences?
All right, Simon. I would honestly say that a good conclusion is normally about a paragraph. All right? So anywhere from 4 to 5 sentences. Because you're really reinforcing your points there, and even your stance, right? And for some people, they're actually using the points that they've written on to say, this is the stance I'm taking because these points overwhelmingly support this stance. All right, so I'd say about 4 or so sentences. Certainly no less than 4 for a conclusion.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Simon. All right. Now, we're looking at some of the verbs, right, that you're going to see on your essay questions, right? You'll be asked to describe, to develop, to discuss, to explain, to examine, to analyze, apply, assess, and even to evaluate. All right? Now, always remember, even if the essay does not say discuss at this level, you always discuss your points. All right? So it's just possibly just, a manner of speaking or, for structural reasons why the term discuss will be included in the essay question, as we call it at times, or essay statement. However, you always discuss. If you're asked to describe, there's still going to be some amount of discussion that takes place in your essay. If you're asked to explain or apply, still a certain level of discussion that is expected of sixth form students for their essay writing. All right? Now, don't worry about going through all this information will be provided in the description of the YouTube video. All right? We'll find a way to get it to you guys. All right? All right, let's move on. All right.
Sir, you're live, sir. You're live right now.
Yes.
You're live on YouTube. So
right.
Everything is on YouTube, so don't worry.
All right. Perfect. All right. So now just looking at some general essay writing tips right here now. All right. So you must determine the aspects and criteria of what the question is asking. Stay within the parameters of the question and answer what was asked, and do not go off tangent. Now, this is common, especially among students who know a lot, or who are, students who are very versed on the information, the knowledge base of Caribbean studies. They tend to write a lot. Now, this is dangerous because when you have 4 essays to write in a limited time, you will spend, say, an hour on your first essay, right? And you're like, yeah, man, I have over an hour left to write the other 3 essays. For your second essay, you spend another hour, and then you realize for your next 2 essays, you only have 40 minutes to complete those 2 essays. You have to be extremely conservative with how much you write on your essays. Be concise, and always, if you have the time, rewrite the essay question on the page that you have turned to, the new page that you've turned to. This is important to kind of help you keep focus on what you're writing, because oftentimes we're writing about coral reefs and the value or the impact of coral reefs. We're making a point about tourism. Our second point is the impact of coral reefs on tourism. And then the remainder of our essay is a tourist essay or a tourism essay, right? It happens ever so often. So as a teacher, you're, wow, good start, coral reefs. And then in the middle of the essay, you're reading a tourism essay. So what I tell my students at times, just jot the question down at the top of your paper so that you are always reminded of what it is that you need to focus on. Now, you must ensure at all times that your essay is analytical. Always, right? Descriptive and narrative essays at this level, even when you are asked to describe, is not acceptable. There must always be some level of discussion and analysis and evaluation in your essays at this level. But you're not asked to come with any long argument. Be concise and precise. Hit the nail on the head on the first strike and move on. All right? Now, more words will not give you more marks. This is something I tell my students all the time. So you'll have a student who will have a take-home essay, and for them, this is a grand opportunity to show all that they have researched and all that they know. So take-home essays are normally 7 pages long, back and front, whole heap of writing. And a 7-page essay can still give you 6 out of 30. It can still give you 9 out of 30, right? You can have 7 pages and still possibly only have 2 points poorly developed. So you must always ensure that you have a focus on the question, the essay question, what you're being asked, the essay points, and how the essay points allotted, or essay marks allotted rather, and how many points you need to have for that particular essay. If for any given essay, you write 200 pages on 1 point, you still can't get more than 10 out of 30 at the end of the day. All right? So make sure that you're very conservative and precise with your writing. And before I get to the raised hand, one last point: establish the premise of your argument with your interpretation of the task and maintain your position. All right, now I'm going to give a very important talk on that, maintaining a position, because in essay writing, we must always ensure that we're balanced. We're writing balanced essays. So while you are taking a stance, or you're asked to take a stance and you're taking a stance, you must always also present an alternative view, showing that you're a reasonable person, showing that you understand the arguments presented by your opponents or your arguments presented from the other side. However, you're not accepting these arguments on this basis. So you need to also present the arguments for those who may oppose your stance. But certainly, You're presenting them to show that, yeah, I understand what you're saying. However, these are the reasons why I don't accept what you're saying. All right? So it's very important that your essay is balanced. Don't only go on about your points, your points. You can't write a self-centered essay only about your worldview, your points, how you view things. You must show the person marking your essay that you also understand the other views presented on the topic. All right? So let me get some questions from you gentle people before I move on to an actual essay and have you help me to actually mark that essay. All right, I see Azalea Smith. Go ahead, Miss Smith.
Good night, sir. Could you say that the Caribbean studies essay is similar to that of the sociology essay?
Yes, there are many similarities in terms of the requirements or what is required of you in terms of how you argue your points, right, to an extent. But I find that Caribbean studies essays, they are argumentative essays, yes. But for sociology, I mean, how you present your arguments can be a little different. So pay attention to the subtle differences presented to you by your Caribbean studies teacher and your social or sociology teacher rather. All right. All right, go ahead, Miss Elliott, with your question.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
My question is in relation to starting the Caribbean Studies essays.
Yeah.
So I wanted to know if it's necessary to include an appropriate definition of the Caribbean, depending on the focus of the question. So, for example, you are given a geography-centered question.
Right.
Would you say, for example, use a combination of the geographical and historical definition to establish an understanding of the Caribbean?
All right. Now, I think this essay that I'm going to present to you will give you a better understanding of how to approach the key terms, right, of your essay. And if Caribbean turns up as a key term in the essay, which, you know, our focus in Caribbean studies is on the Caribbean region, right? However, not all times you're going to be required to define the Caribbean. Not all times for all essays, right? So I'm going to give you an example and possibly this will clarify it for you. If not, then of course you can let me know at the end and I'll try and address it as best as I can. All right?
All right.
All right. So here we have an essay asking us to describe the value of coral reefs to Caribbean society and culture. Asking us to describe the value of coral reefs to Caribbean society and culture for 20 marks. Now, I have some points above that about the approach in how to approach this essay, right? And I have a definition of key terms, and the key terms of any essay, right, are those words or any parts of the essay that instructs the writer on what is expected in the content and arguments presented. Now, the key terms, if you change the key terms of any essay, the whole meaning of the essay would change. Look at this essay, for example, describe the value of coral reefs. A key term is coral reefs, right? If you should replace it with describe the value of sports, the whole essay would change, right? So you must define a term, coral reefs. Caribbean society is another key term. What is meant by Caribbean society? What are we focusing on? Are we only focusing on Caribbean society in the sense of those territories that are in proximity to the coral reefs that we're looking at? Or will the diaspora be included in this? All right? Caribbean culture or culture, right? It's another key term that we're required to define, right? If that term was to be replaced with another, again, it would change the meaning of the essay, All right. So we must ensure that we define the key terms, and we must know what key terms are before we can approach defining them. Now, what is a point in an essay? An essay point is any complete group of ideas or thoughts that are brought across through well-structured sentencing and paragraphing to convince, entice, describe, outline, display, or convert individuals into sharing your worldview or outlook on a matter, issue, or a feature of society. All right. So that is what an essay point is. Now, once you understand what key terms are, what an essay point is, it should help you in writing, actually completing a full essay. All right. Now, we may not be able to go through all the essay, but again, all of this will be made available to you guys. In the interest of time, let us go through a few of these points and look at the approach. Now, for this essay, describe the value of coral reefs to Caribbean society and culture. And of course, I have written here some headings that the essay points will come from. We look at the environment, we look at the value in terms of the economy, we look at the value in terms of value of coral reefs, that is in terms of education and academia, and the value in terms of recreation and even government policies and laws. So we only need 5 points. So we're not going to use all of these points, but certainly these are possible points that you could use for this essay. Now, this is the introduction that we have for this essay. And I really hope that you focus on this example now, because I have a very important question at the end of this introduction. All right? Now, coral reefs are a major part of our culture as Caribbean people. Most Caribbean states experience a tropical marine climate, and all things related to the sea have major influences on our natural environment, economy, and recreation. The importance of coral reefs to Caribbean society and culture is underscored by the fact that Caribbean examination bodies and ministries of education have included their study in the syllabus of students as early as grade 7 through to the tertiary level. For the purposes of this essay, Caribbean society is not limited to territories found within the Caribbean Sea or Plate, and whose borders are directly impacted by coral reef structures located within that proximity, but will also include Caribbean nationals living in extra-regional societies. The culture of the region refers to the way of life, including the value systems, beliefs, and even legal, economic, and political structures that form part of everyday life. In exploring the value of coral reefs on Caribbean societies and their cultures, we will look at the usefulness, worth, benefits, utility, and even desirability of coral reefs on the environment, economy, and the recreational existence of our people. Now, this is the introduction, or what we call an introduction in a Caribbean studies essay. Now, I'm asking you, the audience, what are some of the issues you have identified with this introduction based on the requirements of writing an introduction? Are all the key terms well defined? Anybody at all would like to point out any flaw? Richard Falconer, let me hear from you, Richard.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Yes.
Hope everyone can hear me. First of all, the person who wrote this didn't specify what a coral reef is. By you taking up the paper or you taking up the essay, you should first describe what you're speaking on and define what it is. You're not going to expect the person to take it up and understand what a coral reef is.
Beautiful, Richard. Excellent point. So you see, for this essay, the definition for coral reefs was left out right here, right? And it's important for us to define all the key terms. Did we establish that coral reef is a key term, Richard? Yes, we did, right?
Yes,
all
sir.
Right. Good. All right. So we have one more question. Okori Barnes. Go ahead, Okori. Let me hear your question.
Okay, good evening, sir.
Good evening.
As it pertains to this particular introduction, it's very long. I think that is one flaw, as
Yes.
well as the structure of the introduction. It could be actually broken up into the body of the essay. So for that reason, I think it should be very concise as to like a thesis statement as to what you'll be delving into in the essay. So that's a major flaw I see with it.
Well, you know, I agree with you. And the introduction here is extremely wordy, right? It's wordy. And we must try to be as concise as possible when we're especially writing our introductions and conclusion. We don't want to be too long-winded. Also, there's actually a run-on sentence, an extremely long sentence that causes an idea to go completely blank, right? For the purposes of this essay, Caribbean society is not limited to territories found within, and we go on and on. We could break up that essay, and certainly the teacher will be looking at the inquiry and communication skills for this introduction for sure. Very good, guys. You are pointing out some interesting things right here. All right, let us move on to the first point, and we'll just do 2 points for the interest of time. Coral reefs play important roles in protecting the natural environment of Caribbean countries. They act as wave and storm breakers and prevent the widespread erosion of sand and other coastal soil and rocks. This is an important and useful, valuable feature of the reefs, as our coasts are integral in maintaining valuable seaside real estate that most Caribbean hotels, guest houses, and other resorts and recreational parks are located on. Throughout the Caribbean, coastal lands form some of the most valuable real estate portfolios that investors from all over lease from Caribbean governments or pay heavy sums to local owners to acquire. This was the case with the Rio chain of hotels in Jamaica that brought many coastal lands stretching from the northwestern to north central part of the island. In Antigua, as well, the Sandals chain of hotels have leased large coastal plots for its resorts from the Gaston Brown government and previous administrations. These resorts also highlight another important feature of coral reefs. Apart from maintaining the desirability of the coast, they also act as sanctuaries for a variety of small fish and sea plants. Now, before we move on to what we have in red below this point, can you identify any positive characteristic of this point? Anything positive in this essay point at all? Any bright person? Let me hear from you.
So you have 2 questions. 4 now. You have one from Miss Nadia Elliott, Richard Faulkner, Nia Erskine, and Okuro Barnes.
All right, go ahead, Nadia. Let me hear from you first.
Yes, sir. So what I'm going to talk about is in relation to the first paragraph.
Yes.
Right, but what I was saying, I think that in the first paragraph, talking about the Caribbean society, a more comprehensive definition of the Caribbean could be used.
Yes.
Bearing in mind this topic is related to the geographical phenomena. So
Right.
I thought that a better understanding of the geographical definition of the Caribbean would be appropriate.
Very good. Very good point. Very good point. Brilliant point. All right. Anybody agrees? Well, I'm certain a lot of you will agree on that. Very good point, Miss Elliott. All right. Let me hear from Nia Erskine.
Good night, sir. In relation to the paragraph that we just read through.
Okay. Yes.
Our positive points is that they presented specific examples.
Yeah.
And we're expounding on it in terms of the real estate and how the coral reefs protect those things, because those things are vital to Caribbean economies and all of
Very
that
good.
with the hotel chains.
Yes.
So They presented them and they expounded on them so that it could give them like a real world basis to the presentation of the point.
Definitely so. Very good. Very good. All right. Now let me ask all of you now. Are we seeing any issues with this part of the essay? How is the transition from this point about reefs adding and maintaining value to real estate to the upcoming point about reefs being important sanctuaries for valuable sea life? Did you find that transition to be a little bit abrupt, a little too sudden? Are the 2 points too varying for them to go one after the other? How anybody?
Sir,
Like,
Richard Faulkner is on.
Go ahead, Richard Faulkner. Go ahead, Richard.
Okay, sir. So for this one, for the paragraph 2, I'm saying that there is too much words in it because
yes,
they give examples, but I'm saying that within normal essays we do get a word limit.
Yes.
So we should try to get as close as to the word limit as possible. So my question is, why can't they just add one example and then move on?
Very good, Richard. Brilliant point. As a matter of fact, yes, you are right. One example is more than enough for a point. One solid example, right? We know that you know a lot about the Caribbean. We know you know a lot about, current affairs. You don't have to inject everything in one essay point. You are right. One example is more than enough. All right, I have a number of hands up. I'm going to take one more because I want to get to the other point, the last point before our next presenter. Let me hear from Miss Pattison, Nasha Pattison.
Okay, good night. So the problem that I found with paragraph 2 is that nothing necessarily flows. So the examples are given like as a way of information, but they don't necessarily connect. And the person is not really introducing the other paragraph properly. They just put the sentence there without like giving us a proper introduction of what we're supposed to expect, and it doesn't like run on, it doesn't flow. That's what I got.
Exactly. Right. So at the end there, it just moves abruptly from one to the next. And of course, we'd appreciate a little bit more cohesion from one point to the next. And you are right. As Richard stated earlier, one example is enough. Both examples aren't necessarily connecting. So we could just use one example and leave the other one out. Very good. All right, one last point, guys, before we move on. I'm actually out of time. Now, the coral reefs, this next point, the coral reefs of the Caribbean are havens for many species of fish and plant life society in many ways. It is one of the most desirable consumer fish we have in our region and may fetch a price upwards of $8 per pound unprepared and twice that prepared in many parts of the region. Local fishermen and hospitality players have long sought after this valuable fish up until recently when it was recognized that its value spanned way beyond the dinner table. These fish, once plentiful within our reefs, discharge up to 100 kilos of white sand per year for every year of their lives. This is over 200 pounds of sand per fish per year. So our coral reefs are haven to a fish that is not only one of the Caribbean citizens, not only one that Caribbean citizens love to consume, but it also contributes to our scenic beaches and coastline, which is a major attraction to visitors and locals. The scenic beaches of the Caribbean is one of the major attractions for the approximately 30 million tourists visiting the region each year to spend time and money with locals. Now I'm asking you, how is this point on a scale of satisfactory, good, very good, and excellent? Was the value of coral reefs brought out here? I see we're talking about the parrot fish, right? but was the value of coral reefs itself really brought out in this point? Let me hear what you think, guys. Let me hear from Richard. You had your hand up for a while. Go ahead, Richard. And then we go to Miss Sapleton.
Sir, I have found that it says many fish, many species of fish, but yet it's talking about the parrotfish and what it fetched for a price. This is not necessary in the paragraph because this has nothing to do with coral reef. The cost of a fish doesn't necessarily have to do with coral reef. I find this very poor.
Yes, very good, Richard. Very good. We could have left out that detail. That's not a detail that's important to show really the value of the actual coral reefs. Now, a student will argue, oh, but sir, you know, the coral reefs is a haven to the fish and the actual fish is of value. However, you don't have to put a monetary value there to show the cost of the actual fish. That's an unnecessary detail. All right. And as I said before, guys, you can know so much that it actually hampers you in your essay writing, right? So very good point and very good observation, Richard. And who did I say should go? Miss Sapleton. Go ahead, Miss Sapleton. Kimoya.
Yes, to add, good night. To add to what Richard was saying, the paragraph went on a huge tangent about the fish and not much about the coral reef. So it wasn't giving us some substantial information about the coral reefs, but more about the fish and what it's worth.
It focused too much on the actual fish, right? And possibly this would be good looking at the value of the parrotfish and not necessarily the value of coral reefs. Very good point. What about you, Miss Joelle Smith?
Yes, sir. What just to continue, I realized that after the first sentence of in this paragraph, you're as they said that this person spoke more about the fish. You realize that it was so unnecessary that the supporting points came at more the scenic beaches, how the coral reef helps contribute to the scenic beaches. That's where that person continues really to bring out more of the points, and because it was so poorly expounded on, you only just see like a sentence on it. So it would not
Beautiful observation. Beautiful observation. Very good observation. Very good. All right. Let me hear from you, Michael Smith. Or no, Michaela Smith. Sorry.
Yes, good night, sir. I agree with everyone before me. I can see the point that was raised. This person is saying that coral reefs are havens for species of fish, and that's good. And of course, the parrotfish is a very valuable fish, and it is protected in the coral reefs. That's a good point. But the person, I think, began to stray away from the actual point of making the coral reef the actual subject of the point and not just the parrotfish. And of course, Joel mentioned that they started to mention scenic beaches, which was just out of nowhere. It just came out of nowhere in the paragraph. And I think that was really unnecessary. But on the scale, I would say it was good because there was a point there was an explanation, there was an example. It's just a few flaws that made it, not excellent.
Wow, Miss Smith, are you a teacher? You sound like a teacher.
I am not.
Very good point. Beautiful point. Mr. Humber, do we have time for 2 more questions?
Sir, I will take 2 questions. I see I have 4 hands up, but we have to take 2 questions. We have not done the multiple choice, and it is 15 minutes left before our time is up.
All right, so I'll take 2 questions one from Joel Smith and one from Miss Beth Williams, who I've never heard, who I haven't heard from as yet. So go ahead, Joel, and then, of course, Miss Beth Williams.
Sorry, sir. I'm just lowering my hand. I don't have a question.
Okay, all right. So we'll go to Miss Beth Williams, and then we go back to Simon. Go ahead, Miss Beth Williams. Beth Williams? No, not hearing me. All right, go ahead, Simon, quickly.
I was saying about the closing out of the point. I think the closing out of the point is very poor because the final sentence, it talks about scenic beaches, which it's just completely new. This entire point has been about the coral reef bringing value to the Caribbean through the biodiversity it harbors. And then the final sentence just talks about beaches. It's completely unrelated and not
Very
a great
good
way to close
observation.
out this point. And then also
Very
it has
good.
some grammar cleaning up to do. It has a lot of run-on sentences.
Oh yes, it does. It does. And these are the things that we have to look. And guys, I specifically went on to look at this essay paragraph by paragraph so that you can see the value of actually looking at your essays one paragraph at a time instead of waiting until the end. You read all essays at once. All right. Thank you, young ladies and gentlemen, for your active participation. Thank you for listening to the presentation. And again, we're going to try as best as we can through our Caribbean Studies group to get this information to your teachers and then to you. Have a great evening and enjoy the rest of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thompson. And for those who don't know, this is the book that Mr. Thompson is the one of the authors for. So look out for this book in your bookstores. Our next presenter is Mr. Recardo Valentine, Deputy Chief Examiner for Caribbean Studies. He's going to do a presentation this evening on multiple choice questions, how to answer them, what to look for. Are you going to look for the right test answer or the right answer? Well, Mr. Valentine, are you here? Ready now, sir?
Let me say good night. Not good evening anymore. It should be almost about 10 minutes to 10 Eastern Caribbean people. Good night to you. Good night to everyone and welcome. Well, let me say I'm pleased to be here to talk to you a bit about Caribbean studies. It's pretty late now. I'm sure you would have are coming close to information overload. I've listened to the presentations thus far, wonderful presentations from Mr. Thompson, Lavern, from St. Kitts and Alexander. Wonderful presentation. So you would have gotten a host of expert information this evening that you'll benefit from. Mr. Umber will have to go more in depth in looking at the multiple choice itself at another time. However, I'll just use a few minutes to remind you of some very, very important things, especially really multiple choice. The multiple choice is the most difficult part of Caribbean studies. Now, why do I say so? Because it spans all three modules. And by now, every student should have his or her syllabus on his or her device. I'm sure you'd have told them that, Mr. Umber, right? That the syllabus should be like a Bible for them now. So everyone should have that syllabus downloaded so that they can look at it. Now, when you go through the Caribbean Studies syllabus, you realize that it is extensive, it is huge, and it is a struggle for your teachers to complete on an annual basis, especially in a setting like this where we are not in school face-to-face. Thankfully, we'll be going back soon. And so you're expected to answer 45 multiple choice questions from a syllabus that is so wide. that covers several themes, and one theme can run you into weeks of teaching and learning. And so the most important thing I want you to take away from what I'm saying this evening is the fact that you should get that syllabus. Download it, it is free. In fact, Mr. Humbai, I think you have it downloaded already. To make it a bit easier for them, you could send it in an email. But the syllabus is most important. Right. The syllabus is most important to everything that you will do for Caribbean studies, especially for the multiple choice, because it is, and maybe I should ask, the multiple choice paper will be 45 questions. Can anyone say how the questions will be allocated per module? But type it in the chat if you don't want to raise your hands. Right. So Melissa, 15 questions from each module. Yes, it's kind of crazy, don't it? Because the modules are so long. Now, one of these days, you're going to get into serious trouble with the multiple choice if you continue to do what people do on an annual basis. Just find themselves with some past papers and decide that they're going to SWAT and try to remember everything on the past papers that they see because the question them going to come back. Well, in sometimes they do, but then there are going to be times when you're going to see a complete different paper. And we would have found in marking Caribbean studies that whenever there's a shift in the way the paper is presented, then people tend to do poorly because persons are not taking the multiple choice serious. You would give some attention to paper 2 and the SBAs, even though we are not satisfied with the amount of attention the SBAs are getting. But then you leave multiple choice for swatting. You're going to get some multiple choice if your friend them go and work out the answers. Or you ask the teachers to what is the answer for this one, and then you go back in the exam and try to replicate what you would have seen on the papers. So be very careful, because you don't want it to be a situation where you get that paper and then you're going to find that it is so difficult for you to do. Just this section on geographical phenomena, we could easily write 100 questions from that section alone, from multiple choice. So when we look at the entire syllabus, it is most important that you prepare well. Get the syllabus and ensure that you start paying attention to module 3 in particular. Another thing we would have found, Mr. Thompson has been doing SBAs for a long while. It's one of the most experienced persons in SBA marking, and paper 3-2 also, is that because the syllabus is so extensive, a lot of the teachers don't get time to finish it. And the section that tends to suffer the most is module 3. And you'll get 15 questions coming out of module 3. So again, I'm saying, get the syllabus. See how much time I say? A whole lot of time. Get the syllabus. Now, we have been doing this for quite a while. And so you can trust the advice that we're giving. We are now at a point where Caribbean studies is the leading subject in the entire Caribbean when it comes down to CAPE exams. It took us a lot of work to get there, and there's so much to do still. So we know what we're about and want to trust the advice that we give. So that is the bit of advice I'm giving you this evening, and I do promise Mr. Umba, commit to it, that we will go more in depth into the different areas. And I'm sure Mr. Umba have a whole lot of sessions and so forth planned for you, which will be done through Carib Studies World. So you hear a lot more from us about our programs and what we offer, and how we manage to get the award, the top awards, our students, our participants across the Caribbean on an annual basis. So all the best. Somebody asked what is Caribbean Studies leading in. We're not following the exam results across the Caribbean, it seems, right? It was the subject that get the highest percentage pass. Yes, it was. So we are leaders in that aspect. These are important stuff for you to pay attention to. Very, very important. Alrighty, so Mr. Umba and all our teachers and students and other individuals who are interested in Caribbean studies, it was good chit-chatting with you for a little, and we'll do so more in depth and more frequently than other years to come. Thanks
Mr.
for having me.
In the next 2 weeks or so, we'll be doing another presentation on historical process. I think then what we'll do is just have you go first with some multiple choice of historical process and the geophenomenon, so that they could actually look at that, and then we go into the other presenters.
Okay.
Because it is 9 o'clock now and it's 10 in the Eastern Caribbean. And I know my friends in the Eastern Caribbean must be tired after the long draw today. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is where we end this session. Remember, you can go to the YouTube channel provided by Key Club Jamaica to actually view this lesson. You can also subscribe to it. In another 2 weeks, or in another week, sorry, you will see a recording coming out about the next session in a historical process, not necessarily with the same set of teachers, but different teachers from across the Caribbean, as we try to increase the stock of the grades in Caribbean studies. You will also hear from other markers of CXC Caribbean studies. We thank you for coming on for this session today, and we hope that you enjoyed it. You learned something. We thank the teachers also who came on